of the TOSA All-City Reads Committee. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. A few matters of business. We do have more events coming up, so please check our website and make sure you can come to those. And we also want to give a shout out to our masterpiece sponsor, Beth Jaworski of Shore West Realtors. She makes a lot of these events possible and the distribution of the books possible, so we really want to say thank you to her. And then thank you all for coming out tonight to hear Dr. John Berges of the UWM School of Freshwater Sciences. A lot of his work focuses on the stress, on how organisms react to stress and change in their environment, which obviously we saw how that played out in the book, and now that's happening in our own waters here in Wisconsin. So we're excited to learn more about what's happening here and what some of the effects are on everything from tiny little organisms up to the fish that we are eating. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Berges.
So thanks very much, Megan. And thanks for the invitation to talk. These days I've been lecturing a lot on marine biology, which is one of my passions, and my early education was in the salty side of aquatic sciences. So it's a pleasure to talk a little more about the freshwater side of things. So I am in both the Department of Biological Sciences, trained as a biologist, and in the School of Freshwater Sciences. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself to start with.
Oh, I think it's up here. It's up here.
I should be doing it on my machine. It's okay. We'll go old school then. No, I thought we'd go old school. Hello. Let's try that. There we go. I just want to point out, I've worked in a number of different types of aquatic systems, freshwater systems, marine systems. I did my undergraduate in Canada, in Ontario, at the University of Guelph, center of the Great Lakes, much as we are. And I worked in freshwaters. And then I went to Vancouver in British Columbia in Canada and did a degree in oceanography. Overarchingly, I've worked on really tiny stuff, what we call phytoplankton, primary producers in the oceans and freshwater, zooplankton, the animal-like organisms that eat them, but I also go down to bacteria, to viruses, and occasionally I get a student in my lab who's really interested in fish, and okay, I'll condescend to work on slightly larger things too. So you know, we end up on the water, we end up working in vessels quite a bit. A little technical difficulty here, but predominantly what I do as an educator is I'm out working with students. And I'm actually working with people that are not very much older than the people who feature centrally in the book you're reading. And so young minds, eager minds, I'm trying to help them learn about the world. I'm trying to help them focus on the things they want to know. And so we do a lot of work in local ponds. There's a small pond in Shorewood that we've worked on for many, many years, and it's quite a fascinating little place. We work on the shores of Lake Michigan on some problems. That's some of our students working in the northern lakes up Minocqua area. And so that's a real component of what we do. The research, I often say, is driven by the students. And I'll tell you, secretly, the students are the key resource, right? So the students think, you know, I'm paying my money to go and spend time with the brilliant professors. Well, the brilliant professors, that's fine. My strengths in this collaboration are, I got experience and I got knowledge. That's great. But by this point in my career, I'm kind of running out of good ideas. So like, I got bright young minds here. I'm mining those good ideas. And the other side of it is energy. Like, I don't want to pull all-nighters anymore. I did that, been there, done that. I don't want to do that anymore. These guys do. And so this is the kind of perfect collaboration. The older experience, the younger energetic and new ideas, and this is how we get our research done. So that's really an important element of it. The other thing I think is important to acknowledge is when I went to school, things looked pretty male and they looked pretty white. And so the diversity that was in science, both freshwater sciences and marine sciences, was really, really small. And that was a problem. It was a problem because we weren't representing our community very well. It was also a problem because we weren't getting the full range of ideas and approaches in there. And I'm really pleased to say that is changing. It's not changing as quickly as it should, but the number of students I've been involved with in mentoring has broadened extraordinarily. And I get students now in my lab who are military veterans. I've got students in my lab who have kids. I got one or two that actually have grandkids. So people who finished one career, who come back and retrain to do other careers, that's an incredible diversity, that's a breadth of experience. And so I mentor in a program which is designed specifically to get students from minorities into programs where they have not been before. And that's really important. Not just visible minorities, but also kids from small town Wisconsin who never thought they'd go to university. Those guys are great. And I'll say, I'm kind of from small town Ontario, and I did not at any point in my high school days really see myself doing science at a university. I didn't know what that was about. So I got real sympathy for that. The other thing I'll say, particularly with respect to at least a couple characters in the book, students with disabilities. Now, that's a group which we have not traditionally welcomed into the university, and we haven't understood how to accommodate. And I'm now the principal investigator in a program which has over 38 US universities where we're actually thinking about students with disabilities, not only physical disabilities that you might think about, students who are wheelchair bound, students who have visual or hearing impairment, but also students with intellectual disabilities, students with ADHD, learning disabilities and such. And all of those students now, we're trying to find better ways to bring them into the loop. Industry has figured out for many years that they bring ideas, they bring strengths that we don't currently represent. And now the university is a little bit behind, are starting to figure out that that can work for us too. And so I just want to point that out because I think that has at least a couple echoes in the books you guys have read. Okay. So there's the young man. That's me. And when I was growing up, that would have been sometime in the early 70s, I had my mind not on science. I want to be a hockey player, and many young Canadians feel that way too. So there I was. But at the same time, in Canada and in the United States in the 1970s, there were a lot of really intriguing things going on with respect to the environment, and particularly with aquatic environments. There were also other things going on. And growing up, there's an iconic image, Earthrise, from the Apollo 8 missions. And that has always stuck with me because it shows the beauty of our planet, but it also shows how isolated we are. And the metaphor that many people of that generation took was, hey, it's like we're out here on a little spaceship. And so the concept of the spaceship Earth was very prevalent when I was growing up. A couple points I'd make. Yeah, I'm supposed to be a scholar, right? So I'm going to throw quotations at you here. Buckminster Fuller pointed out, if that's the spaceship Earth, here's one important point. It didn't come with an instruction manual. So as a scientist, part of what I want to do is I want to figure this thing out. How does it work? How does it function? So as a scientist, and particularly an environmental scientist, how does the atmosphere and the water and the geosphere on that planet, how do they interact? How do the living things function on that planet? That intrigues me and has always intrigued me. And the other thing, we're all in it together. There are no passengers here. Everybody on the planet is part of it. We're all crew. And I like that metaphor as well, because it puts some of the responsibility for what's going on this planet right solidly on us. So I like those. And we don't always treat the planet very well, which is part of the point of the book. But I want to take something else that this guy said. Well, before we get to that, let me take a step back. So in the 1960s and 70s, we saw the start of something called environmentalism, where we start thinking about the environment and we start saying, well, it's not just something to study, it might be something to protect and get angry about when we see things going wrong. And that led to activism. Where I grew up in Canada, there was a group at the University of Toronto that developed and founded a group called Pollution Probe. And the idea was, if an industry started doing bad stuff, we're gonna figure out what they're doing, and we're gonna shove it in their faces. And so academics and then the government agencies charged with enforcing could cooperate together, and we wanted the public to rat them out. So we wanted everybody to be involved in this game. We're all crew. And so that was what they called the first green wave. And so our newspaper would have ads like this in it saying, you know, if it were left to industry, the only plants that would grow in Toronto would be manufacturing plants, right? Oh, get upset. Here, join us, participate in this. And there's our poor little plant, and there's these big smokestacks. And for me, those things struck home, because if you went into my backyard and you looked towards Lake Ontario, I grew up not very far from Lake Ontario, that's what I saw. That's a big coal-fired power plant. And on any given day, there wasn't very nice stuff coming out of that smokestack, I'll tell you. So that was kind of where I started, where my thinking went at that point. And then my Aunt Jane got involved. Now my Aunt Jane was about 12 years younger than my dad, and she was a bit of a provocateur. Isn't it the truth that your aunts and uncles, their job is to kind of get in there and stir the pot? If the grandparents should spoil the kids, then the aunts and uncles are supposed to corrupt them. I figure that's the role. My brother Dan knows this well. That's what I get in there and do. And Aunt Jane, boy, well, she didn't know much about kids because she never had kids. And much of the stuff she gave me wasn't age appropriate. Then that's fun too. But when I was about 8 or 9, she got me the official Pollution Probe detective kit. Now I haven't got a real picture of that. I've been looking for them on eBay. I'd love to find one because it was a cute little kit. But it had all sorts of fun things. A little card with a hole in it. You hold it up to the smokestack and you can match the color of the stuff coming out of it. Or a little thing that you could put on the end of your vacuum cleaner and go outside and hold it, and the vacuum cleaner would suck things in, and then you could have a little filter and you could look at the filter and you could see what color it turned and how many particles were in the air. Oh, there were all sorts of cool things there. And that really got me excited about the environment and human influence in the environment. And so that's kind of the background. And sometimes, giving this talk and thinking about that, I kind of get excited again, because day to day I don't do a lot of that. But that's fun. The first course I took in aquatic toxicology, so the things we put into water that have harm, the things that we might call pollution or pollutants. A very wise professor, John Sprague was his name, quoted Buckminster Fuller to us. Pollution is nothing but resources in the wrong place. And so when we think about what we're doing, when we're thinking about what's going wrong, that tells you that there's going to be a lot of perspectives on things. And it's like, well, what's wrong with this? This is not wrong. This is not a bad thing. And so that is really important, because it tells us that there might be nothing intrinsically wrong with the thing we're dealing with, except that it's in a place it shouldn't be. To go back just a little bit, we've got lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, probably too much. Well, carbon dioxide intrinsically is a very positive thing if you're a plant. It's what you use to make sugars and the things you need to live. But too much of it and in the wrong places, that's a problem. And that is the essence of pollutants. So that's a little more background. And so I want to kind of draw us in here. I want to think regionally. I'm going to go a little broader than Wisconsin, but I'm going to talk about things in the Great Lakes and in the Great Lake Basin. I'm going to try and walk us through a few examples of pollution problems, the responses, in some cases the resolutions. And I think what I want to pull out of this is, when we look at these problems and these issues, there's often some things missing in these stories. There's often things, missing elements that are at the root of the problems. One of the problems we have sometimes is our perspective. We look at the world and we're concerned about human health. And we should be, because that's important. But when we look at what we're doing, there's other things on the planet that share the planet with us. And so there's other organisms. And what's good for humans in terms of their health and what's good for other things aren't always the same thing. And so, for example, I look at our drinking water and we say, is our drinking water safe? Is the drinking water of high quality? Is that good water quality? And in Milwaukee and in surrounding communities, we're very lucky. Our water is generally, drinking water, of very high quality. But if you take that, put it in an aquarium and put a fish in it, the fish will die. Because that water is unsuitable for many other living things. So here's perspective. Okay, and some of that is simply because we put a lot of chlorine in that water to prevent bacteria from growing, which is harmful to us. That's going to kill fish. And obviously it's going to kill bacteria. In a natural, healthy ecosystem, you need those bacteria. So here's a fundamental tension. What's good for us? What's good for the environment or an ecosystem? Those are different things. And so sometimes we get into trouble because our perspectives are maybe not what they should be. Scientific understanding. So how do things actually work? If I go into the lab, as I'm going to show you shortly, and make a compound which is really, really useful for humans, how is it going to behave when it gets out into that ecosystem? Could it do things that I'm not expecting? When I see a problem like people getting lead poisoning because of water, Do I understand how and why that happened? What's the scientific mechanism where that happened? These scientific understanding, that's missing in a lot of cases, and that's something we need to figure out. Willingness to commit resources. We make a lot of decisions based on financial constraints, and that's normal and natural. But sometimes doing things the cheap way has consequences, and when we face a problem, there might be a cheaper way to deal with it and a more expensive and better way to deal with it, and that creates a tension. And so the willingness to commit resources, largely financial ones, that's often missing in discussions. And finally, from the human perspective, maybe, a concern for the broader elements of health, equity, social justice in our communities, and the effects that has on our health. It's fine to go in and to implement some solutions like water filters to get rid of lead. But if many members of the communities we're trying to help don't understand how to use those filters, can't afford those filters, then we really haven't got solutions at all. So I think those things are often missing. And I'll tell you as well, and we'll come back to this, the scientific training that people like me get, we don't talk about most of those things other than the scientific understanding. And the problems we face need all of those components. And there's one more thing in here too. So, here's a joke. Oops. No, it's not my handling of the computer, that's a joke too, but here we go. Robert comes in, your money or your life. Victim, don't take my life, I need my money, right? And what is that at heart? Humans. We're not rational. We don't do sensible things all the time. We don't behave. And economists, I got economists, I work with economists at UWM, and economists say economic models would be perfect. The problem is humans. Humans don't do what they're supposed to do. If I raise the price, you're not supposed to buy it. If I lower the price, you're supposed to go nuts and buy it. If I take this wine and make it worth $50, you go and buy the damn thing and you think it's great. If I lower the price, you're suspicious all of a sudden, you say, oh, it can't be very good wine. That's not rational, don't do this, right? And so we do irrational things, right? And sometimes it's like, okay, this company is putting toxins into the water and we should stop that, but if we stop that, I will lose my job. Now, there's a problem. But if that continues, I am going to get cancer and die. But if I lose my job, it doesn't matter. So I'm willing to get cancer or asbestosis or whatever else because I'm going to keep my job. And there are generations on generations of men and women in this country who have made that devil's deal. Okay, so that factors into this as well. So as we talk our way through this, I'll show you some examples, and I want you to think about, in a given situation, what are our elected representatives doing? The people we put in positions in our governments, and at least some of that responsibility is to protect us and keep us safe. What are the scientists doing? So there are scientists in regulatory roles. There are other scientists who are studying these issues and problems. what is their response? And you might also say, what is their responsibility here? And then, what is the response of individuals or communities? In the book that you're reading, I think that is really a key focus here. So think about those things and let me tell you some stories. I want to start with an old story, and that is what we call the eutrophication of the Great Lakes. And I'm going to mix Lake Erie and Lake Michigan. Lake Erie had by far the worst of it, but Lake Michigan was not immune. Eutrophication, great Greek word here. Trophos means eating. Eu means true. So this is real or true eating. What does that mean? Well, basically the process here, we add nutrients. And when I say nutrients, mostly what I'm dealing with here are phosphorus and nitrogen. Things that microalgae, phytoplankton, things I like to work with, need and enjoy and take up and use to grow. And we put those into a water body. And we do that because they're rich in sewage. Well, sewage, number one and number two. That's what we flush down every time we push that little lever on the toilet. Sewage is rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. We're great producers of it. We also put it in our fields because plants use it just like algae do, and so if you want to grow lots of plants and have lots of plants, you got to put more of it on. So our farm operations use a lot of it. We're also, particularly phosphorus occurs in commercial and domestic detergents. There are very, very few compounds that clean as well as phosphorus compounds. Phosphate is fantastic. They used to have this stuff called trisodium phosphate. Some of you may remember that. You got a dirty, grease-covered driveway. You just sprinkle this stuff on it, hose it down, scrub it off. Rich in phosphorus. They actually sell something in the hardware store called TSP, trisodium phosphate. It's not got a whit of phosphorus in it anymore. How they can do that, I don't know. But it's a different compound. It replaces it because if we all do that, we end up flushing a lot of phosphorus into our street drains. It goes into our waterways. And then what happens? All those nutrients go in, the algae basically go nuts, and you get extraordinary growth of the algae. You get massive blooms. Here's a depiction of a bloom. So coastal waters, there's algae growing, and literally you can end up with a real soup. Some of you that have farm ponds or have seen rural ponds in the summer, when we get a lot of warm conditions, we get a lot of sunlight, we get a lot of nutrients. It can get just like that. That's okay for a while, but it doesn't look great. You don't want to go swimming in that. And in addition, when the blooms come up, they run out of nutrients, they die, they sink to the bottom, and they decay. And when they decay, that decay process uses up all the oxygen. When there's no more oxygen, then other things start dying, like fish. And in addition to that, it smells awful. You get all kinds of sulfurous. So there are aesthetic issues. Doesn't look good, doesn't smell good. But then there are more serious issues with oxygen depletion and the death of fishes and such. It really turns unpleasant. So that's eutrophication. And for a while, this was happening in all of our Great Lakes. So here's an example of a fish kill on the shores of Lake Michigan. And that's largely oxygen depletion. There's a bit of temperature, but these are life, which are still in our lake, and just massive numbers of them. And you can imagine what a great day at the beach that makes for. In addition, we get huge blooms which clog our rivers, and it's just really, really nasty. And of course, at one point, Lake Erie hit the presses as being a dead lake, which wasn't at all true, I might add, but that was the popular vision of it. And of course now everyone's upset. Politicians are coming down and being really useful in helping, and, well, at least they're listening. Now, how do we deal with this? Well, in this case, the scientific input was fairly clear and fairly simple. We know what makes algae grow. The environmental harm is fairly straight line. Stop putting those nutrients in and things will get better. Well, they'll get better after a while, because once you've put a certain amount of nutrients in, now they're going to get recycled. And it's going to take a while for them to dissipate. And so the problem doesn't go away straight away just because you stop putting new nutrients in, because there's old nutrients in there getting recycled. Ugh. But in response to this, with good scientific backing, here's a case where legislation helped. And we have two things going on. First of all, within the United States, we have something called the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act, in a very straight line way, helped to regulate. So that's the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Some of you may be aware, elements of the Clean Water Act are currently under threat. And I won't get into that right now, but this was a really landmark piece of legislation. And directly, that helped the Great Lakes enormously. And then the other thing that helped the Great Lakes is, well, I'm proud to say this as a Canadian, I'm a dual citizen actually. That country up north helped because when you've got lakes that are shared, all of a sudden there's an international element to everything you do. And so there's something called the International Joint Commission, and they got together on both sides of the Canada-US border and basically said, we're going to put some rules in place as to what we can and can't do, and we're going to implement some solutions. And so the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, also of 1972, was implemented, and that had some pretty profound effects. Took both sides to do that. So there's a case where legislative agreements at a federal level, in general, really worked. So, not bad. And I should say, we think a lot about the politics of today and our lack of agreement and consensus. Things in the 70s weren't all that much better, either in Canada or in the US, and we got there in the face of a crisis. So, now, move forward to today. There's a couple things going on which, just to update, are problematic. These little white shells, this is a Lake Michigan beach, a picture I took not very long ago. Anybody know who they belong to? They're abundant on the shores.
Zebra mussels?
Zebra mussels. In fact, it's interesting. We've actually got two invasive species, two invasive quaggas. Do you know what a quagga is? Quagga's an unfamiliar name.
Is it a kind of clam? A snail?
So there is a quahog.
That's what I'm thinking of.
That's what you're thinking of. That's an East Coast marine mollusk. So quaggas, I really love this because zebra mussels have a very dark striping. Quagga mussels have a relatively light striping. See, professors, they have to fill you in on all the esoteric stuff. So you may know that many horse species, many equines, can mate with each other. So mules, donkeys and horses mate and we get mules. Well, what do you think would happen if a horse and a zebra mated? well, you probably get something that still had stripes, but they might not be as prominent. Kind of makes sense. That's what we call, or what the South Africans called, a quagga. So quagga mussels have a brownish stripe as opposed to a blackish stripe. That's where we get quagga mussel, okay? So these guys are an invasive species, one of many that have come into the lake. And what they do is they filter the water, they take the particles out of it, and they feed. And they went gangbusters through our lake. They cleared the water. So a lot of the phytoplankton blooms, now that we reduced the phosphorus, a lot of the phytoplankton blooms are much better. The water's much clearer, but now you got clear water. Now you've got light reaching the bottom when before it didn't. And what's on the bottom? Well, we got a whole bunch of well, they call it seaweed. Now I object because it's not the sea, but we have a whole bunch of what I'm going to call macroalgae, including species like this green algae, which is predominantly Cladophora, and that grows in the bottom. Get more light to the bottom, you're going to get more Cladophora growing. Cladophora grows, it washes up on the shore, and now in many places in Wisconsin, you go to the beach, you got piles of Cladophora. And this is intermittent, not every year, but there's another problem. So a subtle variation on what we had before, because there's still nutrients deep in the lake. Much of it is hidden in the bottom sediments, and it's going to take years to get rid of it. If you were to stop water coming in from Lake Michigan and let it keep flowing out the St. Lawrence, assuming it could, we talk about the turnover of the lake as how long it would take that lake to drain out. Or, if we emptied the lake, how long would it take the lake to fill up? And that's an indication of how long it would take basically the lake to clean out. And for Lake Michigan to renew that water, 99 years. So we fixed the problem, still gotta wait for the lake to catch up. That's why it takes time. Do everything right, still got that lag period because that lake takes a long time to clean itself out. Okay, here's the other thing. This is Western Lake Erie. And what you can see in this satellite image is these wispy green bands, and they represent the blooming of a single species. In this case, it's what we call a cyanobacteria. So when we cleared the nutrients going into the lake in general, there's still some inflow, but a lot of the species that were causing the big blooms disappeared. Here's one that persisted, and we get recurring blooms of this cyanobacteria, which goes by the name of Microcystis. And Microcystis is a particularly strange little cyanobacteria because it produces a compound, chemical compound called microcystin. And microcystin, if you ingest enough of it, is a nerve toxin. And so these large blooms can become a problem if they get taken in by the water intakes of cities who don't filter them properly, and then people with health problems drink them. It takes those three combinations: a lack of water treatment, a bloom, and then somebody with compromised health. And you can get people seriously ill because of this. So the rise of these toxic algal blooms, or harmful algal blooms we call them, is the next phase of our eutrophication problems, driven primarily by the same sort of thing. So we solved one set of problems, we've got some subtle variations on them, but again, there's scientific understanding. We begin to understand the subtleties of this, and perhaps there are solutions there too. Okay? So there's one example. toxic chemical disposal. Now this will have real resonance with your book. And the example I want to show you is one that had real resonance for me because I wasn't very far away from it. This is the example of Love Canal, New York. So Love Canal was originally developed as a canal system to bypass Niagara Falls, to make navigable water around Niagara Falls. And there it is. It was built by William Love, which is where the name comes from. And it was originally conceived as a beautiful little canal system, and then you'd build a model community around it. But it never got off the ground. There were all sorts of economic ups and downs, and so the project basically collapsed and fell apart, and it was abandoned in the early 1900s. So what are we going to do? Hooker Chemical Company bought the site, and in the 1940s and 50s, they basically used it for waste disposal. So what they did is they took the canal, they lined it with a very, very dense clay, so that stuff wouldn't seep out of it in theory. And then they took 55-gallon drums, poured toxic waste in it, sealed them, and dumped it in the canal. So they filled the entire canal up with 55-gallon drums of various chemicals. And then they sold the site, and they left that canal full of toxic waste. It got redeveloped in the 1950s, and in the 1970s, the people came along and looked at it and said, oh wow, this is a great place, really cool. Not recognizing that there was toxic waste in this canal system. That toxic waste included over 200 different chemicals, including some really toxic and carcinogenic stuff. So you can look at Wikipedia and pull this up, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but let me just give you an example. We've got all sorts of things that say naphthalene and benza. Anything with a benza in it, things like benzenes, these are really nasty. Benzyl chloride, benzyl alcohol. These are fancy ring-like structures, and those do nasty stuff to human metabolism. And I want you to note, these are the tons of stuff that was dumped. Tons. So we've got like nitrobenzols, 400 tons of them put in here. And we've got 2,400 tons of these things, and trichlorophenols, 200 tons. I mean, these are massive amounts of toxins. And then as we developed it, we built houses on top of it. In fact, over the canal itself, we built a school. That's not going to end well. And people found, I got strange black stuff leaking in my basement. Yeah? Oh, that's not good. And there's these weird smells, and it's just not, no one told the people living there. So health issues started coming, and people went to their doctors, and a couple things ensued. First of all, white blood cells. You've got a normal white blood cell count, and you've got an abnormal white blood cell count. And people's white blood cell count was getting super elevated, which basically means they were reacting badly to stuff. Chromosomal abnormalities, that's pretty serious. About 33% of residents were showing high white cell counts and chromosomal abnormalities. That would be normal in a population like ours, but 1% would show that. So this was really significant. Kids were showing low birth weights. There was a marked increase in miscarriages and a rise in birth defects. And so people started saying, something's wrong. And by 1976 or 77, this stuff ran through much of the 1960s. But by 76, 77, the congressman in the area was jumping up and down mad, and 2 local reporters broke this story nationally and started getting some traction and some attention, so concerns got raised. And the response basically stalled. So it got raised, there was all sorts of resistance, federally, locally, considerable apathy and a lot of stalling, and we come back to that your money or your life thing. A lot of the people that worked in the area, in the housing, at local industry basically said, well, you know, if we have to leave, where are we gonna go? And if we close down things because of this, then we're gonna lose our jobs, and we can't take that risk. And so, is that a misweighing of the danger versus the benefit? Is that just human nature saying maybe it's not as bad? I'm just not going to pay attention. I'll tell you something. When it comes to health issues, there's something chromosomal, isn't there? Men, I'm not going to generalize here, but we're probably less concerned about this. Women, I don't know, guys, if you're married, is your wives kind of nagging you about health things maybe more than you worry about them yourselves? I'm just guessing here. It was the women in these communities that were raising the alarm, that were really pushing. And in particular, I'm going to identify one woman, Lois Gibbs. Her son, Michael, had been diagnosed with epilepsy and asthma and all sorts of other health issues, and she'd had enough. And she organized her community, the Love Canal Homeowners Association. That is her celebrating one of their political victories and one of their suits. By 1978, just a couple years later, because of community activism, Jimmy Carter, recently in the news, declared a federal health emergency. And he designated the Love Canal what we call a Superfund site. So Superfund sites are designated by the EPA, and they basically say, this place is the worst of the worst, and we are going to designate money to fix it, because we can't let it go. And so with that funding, action started to happen and lawsuits. The company, which by this point had been bought by Occidental Petroleum, was taken to court multiple times. Well, they lost in court, but if you read some of the settlements, boy, how about this? They were held responsible. They were negligent. They weren't reckless. What does that even mean? I don't know. So, but the settlements were against them, but the assessments were not probably what they should have been. At any rate, by 2004, we've done a pretty good job of cleaning that up. But think about the timeline, 60s, 70s to 2004. And think of the number of people who lived there, who carried that forward. So here, here's the community. Here's the individuals driving things. Gibbs is still an activist. Among the recent things she's been involved with, she campaigned against sulfide mining in northern Lake Superior, and some of you may be aware of that. There were big proposals to do sulfide mining and concerns about acid mine drainage. She was involved in that campaign, and as well, she's campaigned against fracking, hydraulic fracturing for the gas industry in Pennsylvania. So to this day, still carrying on. Okay, here's another example. Toxic metals. So Flint, Michigan had a water crisis, and in this case, it concerned lead in water supplies and drinking water supplies. So Flint, Michigan is here. on a river system out of Saginaw Bay. And basically, Flint changed its water supply. Flint had been getting its water from Lake Huron, basically the Detroit River. So here's the Detroit River, and Flint had been getting its water piped up from here. And you say, well, it's right on the Flint River. Why is it getting the water here? And it's complicated, but it has to do with contracts and history. But at some point they said, well, wait a minute. For economic reasons, let's start getting it out of the Flint River. Now here's where the science comes in. Lake Michigan, the water in Lake Michigan is slightly alkaline. So the pH scale runs from 0 to 14. pH 7 is neutral, and anything higher than pH 7 is what we call alkaline. So Lake Michigan sits, and in this case, all of the Great Lakes virtually sit at a pH of about 8. They're just alkaline. Most fresh waters, because they babble along and dissolve carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in them, that pushes the pH down. And so Flint River water is at about pH 5. So rather than alkaline water, the treatment plant is now getting water that's pH 5. And here's the science. Lead dissolves in water that's acidic. It does not dissolve in water that's basic. And one of the primary ways you can protect lead from getting out of pipes and into water is by coating the surface of the pipes with phosphorus. And in order for that to work, the pH has to be at about 8 or higher. When they switched, all the phosphorus got stripped off, and all the collected lead on those pipes suddenly went back into the water. Bang! Just like that. Now, if anybody had seriously thought and consulted, they would have known that. But they didn't. And so, when they did that, lead was released from the lead piping in that town. The lead piping wasn't any worse than certain areas of the city of Milwaukee, by the way. But that release put between 600 and 1,200 kids at serious risk, because lead causes neurological issues when you're taking in large amounts of it. And so all of a sudden, a very large number of kids in particular, it affects older adults too, but they're not growing, they're not incorporating that lead the same way that a kid is. And so all of a sudden, serious health issues arose, and kids started spiking lead. Whole bunch of lawsuits. Over $640 million awarded eventually. All sorts of mixed liability about who's at fault. We got resignations of EPA and Department of Environment officials. But I think the real story here, okay, and lead pipe replacement has now become something that many cities, including Milwaukee and area, are now talking about to prevent this from ever happening again. But the people I want to talk about here are actually scientists in this case. So Mark Edwards, this guy, a Virginia Tech civil and environmental engineer, is a specialist in measuring lead in water. And the minute he heard what was going on, he knew what had happened. And he began testing the water and accruing data to show people what was happening. And then Mona Hanna Atisha, a pediatrician and also a professor of public health, she started measuring lead in the kids and showing that as that lead went up in the water, it was also going up in the kids. That tied the whole story together. And then, not only advocates, but also whistleblowers who called people out, and took a lot of crap for it, both in the news media and now also in social media, what's really tragic is Edwards was involved in a nearly identical lead water issue in Washington, D.C. that had happened in 2003 to 2010. Same thing happened. He knew what had happened the minute he heard the early data. Yeah. Edwards' point at the end of this was an interesting one. Scientists, you're not just there studying in ivory towers. You got a responsibility to work in the public interest. So that's an interesting element too. Last one I want to talk about. Forever chemicals. And I'm just going to show you one example of this. We talk about a forever chemical, and what we basically mean is something which we have created, which has never been seen in nature before. And what those compounds basically are, or what that means, is that there ain't nobody out there that knows what to do with them. Nobody out there can, in particular, break them down. There are bonds in those chemicals that nothing on this planet can chop up because nothing on this planet ever made them. So these novel chemicals, and they go into the environment and they persist there, and the more you produce, the more accumulate. So these we're very concerned about. The class of chemical I'm going to talk about are what are called perfluorinated compounds. They were developed a long time ago by humans in the 1930s. They're very durable compounds. Well, obviously bacteria don't erode them, so they're pretty strong. They're water resistant and they're non-stick. And so Teflon, trade name for one of them, may be something you're familiar with. You can put it on all sorts of things and stuff doesn't stick. Okay, cool. So PTFE is the short form for the name, Teflon resins. Let's do some organic chemistry. Anybody have an organic chemistry course? So let me just show you how we do this, because the mystery of the names doesn't have to be that mysterious. So here's one compound, we call it PFOS. PFOS, great name, PFOS. Here's a little stick model, and everywhere we simplified it to avoid doing the alphabet medley here. But everywhere you see this little crossing here, there should be a carbon atom. We've just put a backbone in here. So we name these compounds, they're organic. We name them based on how many carbons they got. So we count. We say, well, 1 carbon, 2 carbon, 3 carbon, 4 carbon, 5 carbon, 6 carbon, 7 carbon, and oh, we drew that one, 8 carbon. So a prefix meaning 8? Octo. So we got an octo something. Now, all of these bonds between the carbon are single. Just one line between them. There's a double bond. If we double bond it, and we have to name them something else. But because there's all single bonds between the carbon, we call those alkanes, and we put the prefix ane onto the octa. So that becomes an octane. Ever heard of octane? Okay, in our fuels, we add isooctane to fuel to boost its power. So that is an octane. Now what else do we do to it? We stick a little sulfur group on the end, and that is actually called a sulfonate. So we stick a sulfonate. So now I've got an octane sulfonate. And then these are fluorine atoms. And I've stuck fluorine all over the place on it. Fluorine, if I play some games with electron, I can turn into something which dissolves really nicely and is fluoride. Fluoride is much less harmful, but you probably brush your teeth with it, right? But fluorine is a gas, really toxic, kind of like chlorine gas, nasty, nasty. But I can stick it all over the place. And what I've done, many is poly, So this is now a polyfluorinated octane sulfonate. That's PFAS. Okay, so there's organic chemistry. Our life on. So compounds like that are super nasty. They have unpredictable effects. And it happens that PFAS and some of its friends are really, really neat. They work well as foams. They don't go into water really well, and they can suppress fire because they spread beautifully over the water and snuff out fires. So firefighting foams are one thing they're great for. They also are wicked cool fabric treatments. Anybody ever sprayed anything with Scotch Guard? PFAS. You were spraying PFAS. I don't want to tell you how much Scotch Guard I put on my outdoor equipment when I was a kid. That's pure PFAS. And it was widely used. And it didn't get broken down, so every bit of PFAS we sprayed out in the environment is still there somewhere. Yo. But we knew, even in the 60s and 70s, oh, this is working now. We knew even in the 60s and 70s that it persisted, it didn't break down, and it was toxic. It caused liver cancer in rats. We knew that in the 60s and 70s. So we had cause for concern. And now studies have shown it's linked to infertility, thyroid problems, certain cancers, so we're even more worried. In fact, parts per trillion. Oh, I can't even, there's nothing I work with in my lab I can measure in parts per trillion. Parts per trillion is an insanely small area. I measure some things in parts per billion, and we work hard to do that. Parts per trillion, that's 1,000 times lower. And this is almost 1,000 times lower than parts per trillion. 0.004 to 0.02 parts per trillion lifetime exposure. So if you get exposed to that just once in your life, it can compromise immune and your heart and circulatory system, and it's linked with low birth weights. Just exposures of that small. Ouch. The US EPA got concerned about PFAS, the general group, in 1998. They issued their first reports about them. There was a health advisory in 2016, so we're coming up close. 3M stopped manufacturing Scotch Guard for a little bit in 2000. They reintroduced it in 2003. It's still got a PFA something in it. It's just not as bad, we think, right? There's
Shorter chains, is that one? Are the chains shorter and like the?
Yeah, this one is shorter, and it's not got as many fluorines on it. It's got bromines in some places, so that's the B. But is that better? I don't know. Yeah, some countries, Canada, Australia, have standards. So they measure it, and you can't exceed. They've got regulations. US EPA, still working on it. Okay, so in that sense, we're a little bit behind. And Wisconsin Sea Grant, who I am funded by in some areas, I've got one student in my lab who's worked on PFAS to see whether algae take it up and what they do with it. It's a priority research area, so we're very interested in what this does in the environment and how other things are affected by it. Scientists. So you probably hear a lot of people talking about a lot of things, but you hear relatively little of what I would call advocacy from scientists. That's starting to change a little bit when we think about this. And Edwards in particular is one of the more science advocate. And reflecting on this, why? Why is this so hard? A couple observations. One, the scientific education really focuses on objectivity and self-criticism. And if you go into advocacy, you go up against other people who don't play by these rules. It's not a good strategy in the public eye. Say, we believe that, well, maybe we don't. this is bad, but it could be wrong. And I'm quite serious. When I work in my lab, we are always asking the question, what if these results aren't right? That is our job, to be self-critical, to be self-reflective. And that does not pair well with the kind of single-mindedness that advocacy does. So that's not a reason for it, but that is one reason I think, that's not an excuse, but I think it's a reason. And secondly, our education in science really neglects two things. One, the social sciences. You're going to address an audience, you've got to kind of understand people. And that's been a sacrifice. We're going to understand scientific things. We're going to ignore social sciences. Good liberal arts education, there's a lot of merit in that. And secondly, public communication. Kind of what we're doing here. We pass this on. And many of my students, I don't want to do that. I'm so interested in the lab. I'd rather stay in the, get out there. Go talk to some people. Talk to your parents. Talk to your friends. Give a talk in the local library. It's important. Connect. But it is changing. And we see a lot of work now on advocacy. There's a, here we go. So just in conclusion, I think that kind of, those kind of examples, I've tried to give you some different stories where different things get emphasized. I'm going to conclude as I do with my students with a couple of broader points. So I tell this to my students, you know, good critics, you question things. In science, authority, not always, but authority should mean nothing. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're Anthony Fauci. I'm not interested in what Anthony Fauci says. I'm interested in the evidence Anthony Fauci is producing. The fact you're Anthony Fauci may mean you got my attention, but if you're not presenting important information that I can interpret, I haven't got time to listen to you. There's other people out there. So this questioning, here are three people I want to think of. I want us to think about. Jack Weinberg. Here's the most famous thing he ever said. Okay, how many people does that disqualify? Jack Weinberg, in addition to many of the other things he did, was an environmental advocate. He actually was involved in the 1987 campaign that prevented a nuclear reactor being built on Lake Michigan in Indiana. Okay? So, there we go. Don't trust anyone over 30. And that was his reply to a reporter who said, well, you're just a youngster. How do you know you're not being manipulated by these older, wiser people? And he said, I don't listen to them. We don't trust anyone over 30. That was what he said. Here's another guy, Lord Kelvin. So Lord Kelvin was president of the Royal Society. Isaac Newton was president of the Royal Society in Britain too, so hi mucky muck. And by the end of his career, he'd done some really amazing things. He had a theory of temperature, he had all sorts of physical laws named after him, really, really brilliant man. Screwed up in a couple of remarkable ways. One, he tried to figure out how old the Earth is, and he reasoned this way. Earth, when it was formed, was super, super hot. It must be cooling constantly. And so if I can figure out how fast it's cooling from its molten original state, I'll know how old it is. And that was a really clever idea. The problem was he didn't understand there are things called radioisotopes. And radioisotopes decay on a much longer time scale and they're super hot. And so his cooling weights were wrong, and he massively underestimated how old the Earth is. Massively, like 3,000-fold too young. And the other thing he did, which is harder to forgive, he told the Royal Society that flat out. So you've got to be humble here. You've got to be humble. And finally, one of my favorite writers, Arthur C. Clarke, speculative fiction, science fiction. Clarke came up with a number of laws. One of Clarke's laws is that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Think about that for a minute. But this is the one I like. When a distinguished but elderly scientist states something is possible, they're almost always right. When they say something is impossible, they're very probably wrong. Okay, so that should be humbling to us. Okay, cool. So that's all I got from you. I hope that's interesting and maybe thought-provoking. And thank you very much for your attention. To talk about just about anything.
How did they clean up Love Canal?
Oh, how do they clean up Love Canal? Well, here's the sad reality. Almost everything they put into Love Canal burns. And so a lot of it they took away to very high temperature incinerators and burned. Now, that's not the worst thing that can happen. Yep. And some of the things that didn't burn, you can actually find high temperature conditions under which they can be decomposed. So they break down.
Did they pull those containers out?
They did. That is one messy job. And worse than that, it had leached into the ground. And so they had to dig up all the ground. And then the ground is toxic waste. And this is tons and tons of soils and subsoils. And then the things you can't get to that are still down there, you basically seal them. You pour something on them that is going to seal them.
Do you have any thoughts about the situation currently in Pennsylvania with the train derailment? Because what I know, I have a science background, I work in environmental science, but I know that there are things that you can smell that's not necessarily harmful.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, just from what you learned and heard, how much is kind of being is like real concern and
Yeah, so in my experience, nothing upsets the public more than somebody in a suit standing up and saying, there's no problem, there's nothing to worry about.
Right.
The minute somebody does that, I start to worry, right? I'll tell you an example that illustrates this well. I did some of my postdoctoral work at Brookhaven National Lab, which is on Long Island, New York. Brookhaven National Lab has 2 nuclear reactors. And so there was constantly concern in the communities, and Brookhaven is on a property well separated from the rest of the communities, big area. But it's got nuclear reactors, and so people were saying, oh, the lab, oh, it's contaminating, blah, blah, blah. And so at one point, there was a leak in one of the reactors, and tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen, got into groundwater, and it's leaked from the lab. And so now everyone in the community is up in arms, and Brookhaven sends its suits out to talk to the public. Nothing to worry about, no problem, no. And what do you think the public does? Of course they get upset. And data comes out, and data, and what does the data show? The data shows that cancer rates are higher in particular areas near the lab. Well, that's really worrying, right? But here's the thing. We know where the radiation went, and we know traditionally the flow of water and air from the lab. And it goes this way. And in these communities, cancer rates are lower. And in these communities, where the radiation isn't going, cancer rates are higher. What explains the higher cancer rates? And what it appears to be is there is an association between cancer, it's weak but it's real, cancer and travel and mobility. The more you move around the world, the more you fly in aircraft, the more different people you encounter, your cancer rates tick up just a little bit, but it's real and it's measurable. What does Brookhaven Lab do? It brings people from all over the planet there to work in the lab. Where do they live? They live here, not here. And so for exactly the wrong reasons, there is an association. But what's going on? Once people have it in their mind there's a problem, and once you send SUTEP to say there's no problem, you've lost that battle already. I don't know what's going on in Pennsylvania, but I do know, one, that was a big public relations mismanagement. There were a much more honest and simple way to deal with that. If we take things at face value, the compounds that are involved should be containable, and we know how to deal with them. They're not pleasant, they're not nice, but we should be able to measure them well. We should be able to clean them up well. And I think sometimes our fears make us smell, and it's happened to all of us, huh? You know, it's, there's something there, there's something so that's a tough one. That's a really tough one.
What did you mean when you said these people travel all around the world, so they're more susceptible to cancer?
Yes, so there is, for people who have,
And the air travel?
yeah, so part of it is the air travel, we think. Part of it is simply the number of people you meet from different places on the planet, the number of potential pathogens you're exposed to that your immune system is challenged with, the number of different bacteria you encounter when you live in rural China or alpine India. So as you travel, your body has to contend with many, many different things in many, many different places. And it's a small effect. It's a really, really small effect. But when you look at it and contrast it, you can detect it. And that's what they were being picked up. So cancer risk that they're assessing, it's probably on the order of about 0.5%. So these people would have a 0.5% higher risk of cancers all grouped together. But that's the sort of thing that we see in the data.
The question I was hoping you would talk about is the fish in Lake Michigan.
Oh!
They're growing tanks of them down there at that school. And
Yes.
they're deformed and having more of one sex than the other, and it's being caused by.
Yes. So there's a couple things going on here. One, the human effects, the one human effect we're having a lot of concern about right now, a lot of the things that we do to ourselves involve toxic compounds or potentially toxic compounds are pharmaceuticals. So we take a lot of pharmaceuticals in, and many of them aren't used in our bodies. They go straight through, which means those go into our water and our sewage and our wastewater and ultimately our lake. And there have been some really concerning studies that have been done on small lakes with large cottage communities around them. One example in Northern Ontario, so from studies that were done in the lake, we started looking at the water in the lake, and here's the kind of interesting progression. So you look for compounds in the water, and what do you find? Well, as they develop, we find caffeine. Well, guess what? Coffee culture came to cottage country. And so people started putting coffee machines in there, or bringing Starbucks home to the lake. And that goes through our system and into the lake. And so caffeine rises. Well, fish are vertebrates, huh? They react to caffeine much as we do. Have you got a whole bunch of fish in the lake that now can't get to sleep at night because they're dosed with caffeine? I don't know, but that's possible. And then we got an aging community in there. And some of them have things like diabetes and take insulin, and insulin goes through, and that goes into the lake, and insulin has effects on fish too. And the younger community, some people take birth control pills, and birth control has estrogens, and the estrogens go into the lake. And guess what? We find a whole bunch of fish that aren't reproducing anymore because the estrogen products in birth control pills have equally strong effects on fish pop. Oh no.
So wastewater treatment doesn't. and
Most
treatment.
wastewater treatment does almost nothing. The lake is a pretty good example.
So we're
because
drinking the
most-
same water those fish are living in.
Potentially, but the issue there is the effects for us are gonna be much, much lower, because when we drink, it doesn't go, it goes into our guts and we absorb very little. For the fish, because they breathe in the water, their blood supply and goes through their gills, they take in almost every compound. Fish are a terrible
Because I've been worried
example.
about that, but it's like, you know, if those fish are dying and getting
Yeah.
deformed, and it doesn't come out of the water treatment plant, then what happens to us? So when it goes to the gut and isn't absorbed.
Yes, but I will say the other thing about growing fish is we have a much shorter history of it, and as opposed to agriculture where we've got hundreds of years experience with those animals, we've got very little experience with the fish, and so the other thing that can cause deformities is you're not stocking the fish at the right density, you got them too crowded, that's a problem. And then the water quality you're maintaining just isn't quite right because you haven't figured out how to do it properly yet. And so many of the problems we experience in aquaculture are because we're not controlling it, we're not doing it quite right. So it may be a water quality issue, that's legitimate, but it may also be we're just not very good at raising fish in those tank environments because that's not very natural either.
Okay.
So it's a combination of things.
I have a question on where you think our greatest risk is right now. Is it in the air, is it in the water, is it in the dirt? I mean, I'm afraid if it's in all of those places at once, we're doomed. But
Yeah.
is there one area we should be concentrating our efforts, or?
Well, I worry most, I think, right now in terms of, and so I would also say, I am constantly amazed at how resilient human beings are. I mean, we, on the face of it, you know, we bemoan our fates and we say how horribly unhealthy we are, but you know, I look at my parents' generation and I look at my friends' generation at similar ages and I think, you know, we're a lot more fit. Granted, we're doing things that they didn't. I've now got two friends who have had knee replacements. Replacing knees? My God, could you do that? And now these guys are out running on fake knees. It's like, what are we gonna replace next? I don't know. So I'm, on the one hand, we got great medical care, we're resilient, we're healthy. The environmental aspects I worry about most aren't to us, they're to the other organisms in the environment. And so the pharmaceutical side bugs me. You know, we're putting massive amounts of things that we design for us out there, and we're taking a lot more drugs than maybe we need to because the pharmaceutical companies are spending a lot of money to see that we do. And that gets out into the environment. I think that's tractable because there are ways to treat waste, and we know some of them. Will we spend the money to implement them? I don't know. But there are ways to control that. But I worry most environmentally about those compounds and how they get in the environment and who they affect. So
But ultimately, if it's not habitable, you know,
yeah.
it won't be habitable for us.
Yeah.
Just, I wanted to give a shout out to the drinking water treatment in Milwaukee, which is, I don't want anybody to be afraid of Milwaukee
Yes.
water at this time and go get bottled water. Because while it kind of comes back to what you said before, while the wastewater treatment, they do a great job too, but they're not taking out pharmaceuticals and things. But the way of treating through the
Yes.
charcoal beds and everything
Yes.
takes out, I mean, it's extremely good water.
Yes, and thank you, because we really should distinguish our water supply versus the wastewater. And once again, perspective, we do a fabulous job, and we've got some really good learning systems. I think the probably the cryptosporidium problems that we experience.
That's where the scientists didn't study what the quantity that they needed to put in.
And that led to some really significant improvements in monitoring and particularly sandbed treatments, which have just,
Ozone too.
Ozonation.
the
Ozone.
ozonation, yeah. So there's some really positive things there too. But yeah, it's great water.
Can you talk a little bit about the threats to the EPA and the Clean Water Act?
Yeah, so,
Right,
Um,
and then that's also a runoff issue.
it's hard to know. So I mentioned threats to the Clean Water Act, and I mean, on the face of it, the threats, they have to do with two things. They have to do with regulatory powers, and they also have to do with the way that things can be fast-tracked for EPA approvals and what requirements and what roadblocks can be put in. So some of the legislation, literally, the very basis of some of the Clean Water Act legislation was, let me put it this way, thou shalt not put anything into water that's going to hurt fish. That was the basic tenure of it. And you can't put it into any water that fish live in. Okay? So that's super broad and very powerful. But then the devil's in the details. So what water are we talking about? Is that really water? Now, that's a wetland. But was that a wetland 100 years ago? I don't think that's not really water. And I don't think fish live in that water. They may be in there sometimes, but they're not in there routinely, and so that's the sort of way we erode it. So, one, that's not really water. Two, that's not really water that fish are in. And then we get into what do you mean harming them? Is it really harming them? So these little ticking away erosions, and it'll be fought by court cases and precedents, and yeah, and different administrations choose to fight, and certain administrations choose to just not fight. And the Justice Department in particular has been stronger and weaker, and what cases do we take and what do we leave aside? So, yeah.
Should we be greatly concerned about the lead pipes in our water supply, you see?
So the lead pipes we've got here, with the pH of the water we've got, the very simple thing that we can do is to add phosphate. Now, I mentioned phosphorus is a thing that causes algal blooms. Now, here's the nastiness. We add phosphorus to the Milwaukee and other water supplies. What does that mean? It means, for example, that when I see my neighbor out there and he comes up to me and he says, "Yo, John, I'm so pleased with myself. I went to the store and I got this phosphate-free lawn care product, so I can spread this on the lawn, and it's got a little bit of nitrogen and iron, and it makes my lawn green up, but it's got no phosphorus. I'm feeling real good about myself." And I'm saying, yeah, when you turn your sprinkler on, your city water's full of phosphorus. You're spraying phosphorus all over your lawn. Man, Phil, I don't have the heart to tell you that. I'm gonna pat you on the back and say, good job. Because it is a good job, and you're thinking, and I appreciate that, but as long as we do those two things, and, here's the and, we don't disturb the pipes, we don't do construction and shake up the pipes, then we're kind of okay. But that's not a long-term solution, because those pipes are gonna age, they're gonna start falling apart, and when they do, we're gonna release melts of lead. So it's not a long-term solution. Short-term, I don't think we panic. What can we do? In areas where we're showing lead in the water, the thing we can do instantly that completely solves the problem is water filters. water filters, even in the fridge, good quality water filters. Not, standard Brita won't take lead out, but there are ones slightly more expensive that will. Problem is solved, but here's the problem. They wear out. How often do you check them, and how often do you replace them? And it's easy for people with a certain income to do that, but low-income people, really hard to get the word out, really hard to provide the filters, really hard to get the filters changed. My house, we've got lead supply lines. I put an under-counter filter on. We estimate how much water we use, and that can be changed. The one I've got costs $100. I plumbed it in myself and change that every 18 months. No lead's coming through that. So in the short term, there are lots of solutions we can implement. So that doesn't scare me in that sense, but I'm thinking of all the people that can't do those things or don't do those things. There is a problem, and their kids in particular. The best thing we could do is replace those lead lights, and then the problem is gone. That's going to be an upfront capital cost, but it is the right thing to do. The problem is we can't do it by half measures. It's kind of like, oh, we're going to replace them here, and we're not going to replace them here. And excuse me, when you replace them there, you're going to shake up the whole system, and you're going to release a lot of lead. Yow. So it's no easy solution, but as an issue, that's a problem. But we've got tractable things that we can do. I've got a colleague in our public health department who's really trying to think creatively about how we get lead abatement products and how we implement this in some of our poorest communities, because it is an issue.
But the bottom line, if the water system wasn't disturbed, the old lead is not moving.
The old lead's not moving until those pipes need to be worked on, which is happening, and increasingly so, and they're really reaching in many places they're reaching the end of their useful life. They're not gonna last forever. And
I get it.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Cool.
All right, if there are no more questions, thanks for all.
Great question.
At the end of our time anyways.